Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is For the Love of Bees, Protecting and Photographing Pollinators, presented by pro photographer and WWF's Manager of Pollinator Conservation, Clay Boltz. Thank you so much for being here today, Clay. Over to you.
Thanks, Brooke. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity, particularly in spring, to talk about some of my favorite species in the world. Montana is where I live, and Montana is a place where the bees have to wait a really long time to come out. Even just this week, we had some snow. So anyway, I'm thinking a lot about bees right now, and I hope that wherever you're at, that you're also seeing some bees around. I always like to start off my talks with one sort of grounding fact that I think is really important and really describes why I'm so passionate about trying to help protect insects and other species of invertebrates because they're so vital to our world. And that is that over 99% of life on Earth is smaller than your finger. And so when we think about wildlife in the world, generally we are thinking about very large animals, elephants and rhinos and bison and species like that. But part of the reason for that is because we are also some of the largest creatures on Earth. We are in that 1%. So even though there are species like blue whales in the world that are much, much larger than we are still in that small majority of species that are quite large. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult for us to associate and to pay attention to those small species. But the truth is, without that 99% of small species that exist in the world would basically cease to exist in the way that we know it, at least, because they are so important to keeping ecosystems intact, doing everything from pollinating flowers, as we'll talk about today, to keeping soil healthy, to filtering water, you name it. Insects and invertebrates are there doing a lot of work for our world. And I always think, if bumblebees were the size of tigers, people would be paying a lot more attention to them. But as I mentioned, they're small, they're moving around quickly in the landscape, and so therefore it's harder for people to make those connections. Now today, we're going to be talking about pollinators, and there are a lot of different species of pollinator or groups of animals that are pollinators in the world. Of course, we know that there are birds that are pollinators, like hummingbirds, but there are also sunbirds in Africa, for example. Several different types of birds are pollinators. We know that butterflies can be really good pollinators. Even ants can be pollinators. You can see here on the top left in this winter ant, she's covered in pollen. Flies, believe it or not, are really great pollinators. Here in Montana, for example, because of the way that many flies overwinter, some of the first pollinators we see each year, certainly in abundance, are flies. And in the southwest of the United States and further south from there into Latin America, certainly a lot of bats are really fantastic pollinators. But the king, or I guess I should say the queen of all pollinators, are bees. And there are some reasons for that, which I'll get into in just a moment. But first, I thought I would define what a bee actually is, because I think, we kind of know what a bee is, but we don't, I think a lot of people don't understand sort of the lineage of bees and where bees came from. So bees are, there are a lot of insects in the environment that look like bees. And so it's often confusing not only to know what a bee is, but really, and where a bee came from. But when you're looking in your garden, sometimes we see things that we think are bees that are not actually bees. So for example, this is a really famous book, Bees of the World. And unfortunately, the only bee on the cover of this book is actually the letter B. The insect that you see on the cover of this book is actually a fly. And while this fly is certainly doing some pollination work, it's not even one of the flies that often does pollination work. So it's really interesting that even on books, sometimes people get it wrong. And it's for good reason, because there are a lot of species of fly that looks very, very similar to our bees. So for example, both of these images here were photographed on the left here, were photographed in Montana. The insect on top is a type of pollinating fly that mimics bumblebees. And then the bee below, this is a central bumblebee, or Bombus centralis, looks very much like this fly. In fact, this fly, it visits flowers regularly. It flies like a bee. It sounds like a bee when it flies. It moves like a bee, like there are so many similarities in this insect's evolution that are intentionally trying to trick others to thinking it's a bee because, of course, we know that female bees, not male bees, no male bees can sting, but female bees can sting, and therefore a predator might avoid this this fly, which is defenseless. Same goes, it happens everywhere in the world. This is a species in the top right from the tropics. I photographed this fly in Guyana, and it's a fly that mimics orchid bees. So this is a species of orchid bee here on the bottom that looks very similar to this fly. So there are a lot of flies who, for whatever reason, are able to evolve fairly quickly and evolve patterns that are very similar to bees. And sometimes it's not just for avoiding predation. Sometimes it's because the fly is itself a predator. So this is a type of mimicry called aggressive mimicry. And the fly on the top left is a type of robber fly called a bee killer robber fly that feeds upon bumblebees. And so these were both photographed in South Carolina, where I'm originally from. And the robber fly on the top, again, looks like a bee, flies around flowers, sounds very much like a bee when it flies, or a bumblebee. But what it does is in turn trick the bumblebees into thinking it's a fellow bumblebee, and then catches those bumblebees to feed upon them. And I should say that, just because there are these predators that exist in the environment doesn't mean that they're bad. I mean, these species have coexisted for millennia, and it's really important to make space for all of these species because they all have their roles in the environment. Well, the truth is that bees are relatives of a very ancient group of insects called sawflies. Sawflies look a little bit like a cross between a wasp and a bee, but they have a very different segmentation from their head and their thorax. The first two segments of this insect's body are fused together, whereas with a typical bee or with a bee, you have the head, thorax, and abdomen. You have those three parts of the body. But these insects are the ancestors not only of bees, but of ants. Ants evolved from sawflies, wasps evolved from sawflies. And you'll notice here in this picture of a cicada killer wasp that it is has paralyzed a cicada. And the reason it does that is because it feeds its young these paralyzed bodies of insects, and then other species of wasps will do this with spiders or crickets. And they basically will take this into its burrow, lay an egg on it, and that's what the young will feed on. It's a really gruesome way to go for the cicada, but they don't have refrigeration, so this is the only way to keep their food fresh is by paralyzing the host for their young. But the important connection to make here is that this wasp is feeding its young protein. And so another form of protein that exists in the natural world is pollen. And somewhere along the line, many millions of years ago, some species of wasp began to give some pollen to their young in place of these paralyzed insects or in tandem. We don't obviously know exactly how this all came to be, but at some point, wasps decided that this was a good way to feed protein to their young. Maybe it was an easier way than trying to risk, getting hurt, the mother getting hurt while she's trying to subdue a spider, for example. And so essentially, what we realize is that bees are vegetarian wasps. They are still categorized within the larger family of wasps. They have just switched that protein that comes from other insects and invertebrates to protein in the form of pollen. But you can see that superficially, wasp and bees still look very, very similar in a lot of ways. But there's one big difference that makes bees the ultimate pollinator and really the best pollinators in the world. And if you look at a bee under a microscope, what you see are these specialized hairs called scopal hairs. They're very feathery. The we'll say that the patterns of the hairs vary greatly among many different species. But what's so cool about these hairs is that they hold a static charge. So not only are they perfect for grasping pollen, and pollen is very sticky, and pollen is different shapes of granules. So again, you get these different ways that these hairs might look. But these hairs hold a static charge. So in many cases, when a bee lands on a flower, pollen is actually leaping onto the body of the bee. And so this is the reason that bees are such good pollinators because they have these specially adapted hairs that other insects don't have. I first started getting interested in bees around 2012 or 2013 when I found this headline from Time, A World Without Bees, the price we'll pay if we don't figure out what's killing the honeybee. And at the time, even though I had spent much of my life and then my career really focusing on trying to help protect small species, both as a photographer, a conservation photographer, as well as working with various conservation nonprofits, I didn't know very much about bees. Of course, I knew that honeybees existed and I knew that there were bumblebees and sweat bees, but I didn't really know much more beyond that. And so I decided that I needed to help tell this story to get people focused more on honeybees. And so I went in my backyard. I was still living in South Carolina at the time, thinking I was going to photograph honeybees. But instead, I photographed these two really small bees, both smaller than a grain of rice. And they were so beautiful, and I didn't know exactly what I was looking at. I just knew that they weren't honeybees, and they were really just such extraordinary little creatures that I had overlooked. Like I had no idea that we had these really sparkly green metallic bees in my backyard. And it turned out as I did some research that honeybees, the species that everyone was so concerned about, were actually introduced from Europe in the 1600s alongside cows and chickens and our other domesticated species. And while humans have had relationships with honeybees for thousands and thousands of years, I think the earliest records of beekeeping is like 10,000, goes back around 8 to 10,000 years. And who knows, beyond that, certainly with indigenous cultures in Africa and other places, there are these long-standing relationships with bees. But here in the US, this is basically a domesticated species. And because of that, the chances of honeybees going extinct is, you could almost say, similar to the chances of a chicken or a cow going extinct. Like these are domesticated species. Yes, honeybees are dying off because of colony collapse disorder and because of parasites and those kinds of things, but we can breed them, at least currently, in greater and greater numbers to sort of backfill that loss. That doesn't address the losses of these bees due to things like neonicotinoid pesticides and habitat loss and other things. But in general, honeybee populations are okay, in balance. However, what I found out at the time is that we have 20,000 species, known species of bee in the world. There are multitudes more because many bees look very similar to one another. You have to do the genetic work in many cases and close examination to tell the differences. But there are a lot of native species in the world of bee that are doing a lot of really important things because these bees have evolved, as you'll see, to do lots of different types of things in the environment, whether that's living in certain kinds of habitats, or visiting certain kinds of flowers, or flying during certain types of times of year. These bees are all doing different kinds of things in the environment. And as you saw earlier, and this is another photograph, just throwing this in, of an orchid bee that I photographed in Colombia. Um, our native bee species, the world's native bee species, are absolutely incredible looking. They're so beautiful, super fascinating. And the thing that I find really exciting as a photographer is that, for example, when I first started photographing native bees around 2013, I was one of the first macro photographers to focus exclusively on native bees. There were a lot of photographers doing different things, but like one thing I learned right away is that we just know very little about these species of bee. Like even with bumblebees, which only have 250 species in the world, we have not found nests for most of those species. We know their general biology, but we don't know very much at all, even with species that are easy to see like bumblebees. Here in North America, we have around 4,000 species of native bee. That number is climbing as well. For example, I live in Montana. Pretty much the eastern side of the state is pretty much a black hole in terms of what we know about the bee diversity there. And we're finding species not only that are new to science, but species that we didn't realize lived in this state. So there's just so much opportunity for discovery. And these native bee species come in a variety of colors, shapes, sizes, as I mentioned. Every time I go out and photograph a new bee, it's like going to a candy shop because all of these bees are just so beautiful and unique in their own way. It's very much like a little bit like Pokemon. If you have kids or grandkids, or if you have ever been a fan of Pokemon, which was developed actually by a Japanese man who was very interested in insects as well. So you can see the comparison of like, as a photographer, I'm like, I've got to collect them all. I've got to photograph them all and see what I can do to photograph their lives. One thing that I think is super interesting is the ways that bees have evolved to carry pollen. So one of the ways you can determine the group or the tribe that various bees are in is by looking at the ways that they collect pollen. So for example, we'll look at a bumblebee to start with. Bumblebees are closely related to honeybees. They're in Apidae, the same group. And if you look at a bumblebee's back leg, you'll notice something that's kind of interesting. It's called a pollen basket or cabicula. And you'll see these hairs that are curving inwards towards this very smooth part on the back leg. This is where these bees place what's called a pollen ball. And so they are collecting pollen all over their bodies, and then they scrape and groom this into a ball and place it on the back leg. So, for example, you can see here this species of bumblebee photographed in Wyoming with a big ball of pollen on its back leg. So honeybees will do a similar thing, but all bees don't do collect pollen in the same way. So for example, in late summer, we get these really interesting longhorn bees that come out across the US. These bees are more messy pollinators. They collect pollen all over their body. They don't really have a place to put a ball of pollen. So they'll compact it and then they'll keep foraging, but it's a very messy way to collect pollen, which is great because more surface area, right? Like the more opportunities they have to collect pollen on their bodies. And a lot of these bees are ground nesters, so this works pretty well for the way that they enter into the nest. However, other species of bee, like leafcutters and mason bees, collect their pollen beneath the abdomen. Um, yes, they have scopal hairs all over, but they're primarily trying to collect the pollen underneath the abdomen. So you'll see them dabbing the abdomen on tops of flowers, moving around very quickly. And then when they come back to the nest, and this is a bee hotel, this is a mason bee here with one of her nest that's completely filled in with pollen, and then she's capped it off with some masticated vegetation and pollen and other things mixed together. The reason that these bees carry the pollen beneath their abdomen is because if they were to have it on their legs and they were crawling into these tight tubes and spaces where they nest, then it would get scraped off when they enter into the nest. So by having it underneath their abdomen, it means that they can protect the pollen until they can get into the cell. Other bees, like these very tiny yellow-faced bees, collect their pollen internally. So they're digesting the pollen, they're swallowing it, and then when they get back to the nest, they regurgitate it. And part of this, is probably due to the fact that these bees are very small, so it would be very difficult for them, or more difficult for them, to carry sufficient pollen with them. And they also will nest occasionally in stems of like raspberries and things like that. So probably a similar scenario to the leafcutters and mason bees in terms of keeping the pollen beneath their body. And just for scale, this is a fennel flower, so a super tiny flower. If it gives you a sense of, this bee is probably about half the size of a grain of rice. It's a very tiny little bee. But one thing that's really quite interesting is that bees of various kinds can be generalist or specialist. So like bumblebees are generalist pollinators. They will visit lots of kinds of flowers, honeybees as well. Whereas some, like this globe mallow bee in the genus Diadacia, only visits globe mallow flowers. We also, a really cool story that I would encourage you to read up on are our native squash bees. So it's really a story of immigrants because squash originated in Mesoamerica, and as indigenous communities traded squash, it moved further and further into North America, and these squash bees followed along behind the plants. And so even today, we primarily rely on squash bees to pollinate squash flowers because squash pollen is very spiky, it's very sticky and large, and many bees are not able or don't want to carry that pollen. It's even possible that there's a slight toxicity to squash pollen that deters other bees. But squash bees love it. They get up in the morning before honeybees even leave the bed, and they're out there doing their thing, even sleeping in the blossoms sometimes to make sure they're there the next day. And then there's some really extreme examples. Here in Montana, we have a plant called the death camas lily. It's a small plant that's found in grasslands. It's very, very toxic to wildlife and to livestock. And so pollinators, other species generally will avoid it. But this death camas mining bee has evolved to be the only bee that can feed upon the nectar and the pollen of this flower. So it's a really unique adaptation that, it just shows you how it's important to have these specialist bees in the landscape and go beyond the honeybee, because our native species don't really have the protections, generally speaking, that our domesticated species do. Just to show you a couple of more fun examples of adaptation, this is a fuzzy-legged leafcutter bee that I photographed in Madison, Wisconsin. He has these very fancy fringes on his front legs. This is a male. And the reason he has those is because when he's mating with a female, he covers up her eyes so that she can't see let's say, a more handsome bee flying past. He's a very jealous kind of bee. So there are several bees and wasps that employ this really interesting technique. And then other places like the Atacama Desert in Chile, there are weird bees that have evolved to take nectar and pollen from plants that really are protective of their nectar because they're living in hot, dry desert areas. Atacama Desert's one of the driest places, if not the driest place on Earth, and so it is very, very arid. And so the bees that live here to have had to adapt to visit those plants that are evolved for arid places. Similar in South Africa, this is a retaviva bee that visits types of snapdragon, I believe, and it uses those really long legs to go into the flower to collect floral oils, which they use in the construction of their nests. But there are lots of different kinds of bees. This is a bee I photographed in Indonesia called a neon cloak and dagger bee that has scales on its body similar to a butterfly's wing. There are bees that fly at night. This is a really interesting species of bee that I photographed in Arizona that wakes up around 4:30 in the morning. I know this because I was out waiting for this bee to show up. And it visits, the first thing it does is it visits an agave flower. It collects the nectar from an agave, and then it visits these nightshade flowers and collects the pollen from the nightshade. Right now, it's doing something called buzz pollination, where it's vibrating its body to cause that pollen to fall over onto its body. And then it mixes the nectar and the pollen together and essentially brews beer to feed its young, the microbes that are created during this, we'll call it a brewing process. And it has a very interesting nest that's almost like the plumbing on your toilet. This sort of goes in a curve so that they don't have to cap it off to allow those gases to escape from the brewing process, um, but also keeping it from evaporating. They're also really amazing habitat. This is a bee that was discovered or described within the last 2 or 3 years, that lands on water. This is in southern Arizona, that lands on water in a very desert habitat when there are puddles from rain, collects the water in its crop, its honey crop, and then flies to where it's building its nest, releases the water on the soil to soften it up for digging. So there's lots of really cool things that bees do. And they come in a variety of different sizes as well. This is a very small species of cuckoo bee that you can see is many times smaller than a dime, a US dime. However, there are bees that are actually smaller than this, believe it or not. So just to give you another example, this is in my backyard here in Montana. This is a very tiny species of mason bee. And to give you a sense of how small this bee is, there's its nest next to a dime. There's my camera lens. So it's a very teeny tiny bee. And you can see how it's reusing a nest entrance that was created probably by a carpenter ant. And then when they finish provisioning it with pollen and eggs, they will cap it off with wax like this. But there are even smaller bees. So the smallest bee in the world is called Perdita minima, or the Euphorb mini fairy bee. It's found in the deserts of the United States, from Texas west to California. And I photographed this last year in Arizona, and you can see just how tiny this bee is compared to this other bee. But interestingly, I am also the only person in the world who's photographed, or the first person in the world, I should say, who photographed the world's largest bee, Wallace's giant bee, in 2019. I was part of an expedition to rediscover the species, which was thought potentially to be extinct. And to give you a sense of how large Wallace's giant bee is compared to the smallest bee, here is the silhouette of the smallest bee next to the largest bee. And this giant bee is about, from head to tail, about the length of my thumb, and then the wings are, much wider than that. So bees come in an amazing range of scales, sizes, and even as fearsome as this giant bee looks, I think it's important to remind people of a couple of things. A, most bees, generally all bees, have no interest in stinging people. Occasionally it will happen, but most bees are solitary. Over 70% of the world's 20,000 bees are solitary, which means that they um, are, you could essentially say they're hardworking single mothers. They are out collecting pollen and nectar, digging their nest, laying those eggs, and continuing to do that until the end of their life cycle. They don't have a large colony to return to or defend. They don't have a larder of honey like honeybees to defend. And in fact, honeybees are the most aggressive bees that we have in North America. And I would argue in general in the world, honeybees are the most aggressive because of their biology, because they have this huge colony with honey to protect. They're long lived, and so they have more of a true caste system as well, where they have a true queen. They have a true worker class caste. They have the males are only drones that are out for a few days. So that division of labor allows these honeybees to be more altruistic. You can say they're willing to sacrifice themselves for the colony, but that's not true with most bees. And as I mentioned at the beginning, only female bees can sting. No male bees of any kind can sting or have stingers. So the odds are in your favor that if you don't squash a bee or try to pick it up, or it doesn't get trapped in your clothing, you're probably not going to get stung. The group that I work on the most are bumblebees, though. I find bumblebees to be not only are they super pollinators, but they are some of our most threatened species of native bee in North America. There's around 250 species, and one out of every 250 species in the world, there's around 48 in North America. There's more species of bumblebee in Montana than any other state. And part of the reason for that is because bumblebees evolved millions of years ago during a period of global cooling. Our earliest bumblebees were in the ancient Himalayas. I should say when the Himalayas were still quite young, but it was the early days of the Himalayas. And during that period of global cooling, the ancestors of bumblebees, the proto-bumblebees, were more wasp-like in appearance. But as the temperature cooled, they became fatter or bigger bodied. They developed these amazing hairs that you see all over their bodies. So it really allowed bumblebees to be the survivors in cold temperatures. And so even today, you will find bumblebees flying in places like the Arctic. This is up in Alaska. You'll also find them along our coastlines. They're quite adaptable. You'll find them in our cities. And so bumblebees are a great, not only are they a great species because of all the pollination work that they do, but they're fat and fuzzy, they're easy to see. And because of that, people generally love bumblebees. And because they're generalist, again, if you help protect a bumblebee or you provide habitat for bumblebees, there's a good chance that you're going to be helping a lot of other species as well. And as I mentioned, the other reason that I care about them is because they are so threatened, and many are quite endangered. I was actually involved in the listing of the first species of North American bee, the rusty patched bumblebee, which was placed on the endangered species list in 2017. And this was, again, the first North American species to receive that protection. And really, I was really made a believer in the value of using bumblebees to go forward with conservation messaging about bees after that campaign because of the number of support people supporting the effort, that came forward. So many amazing things happened, and even today we continue to see people really focused on bumblebees in places like Madison, Wisconsin, and beyond. So bumblebees are that perfect sort of keystone or flagship species to help protect other bees. Now, because we're here to talk about photography and bees, or bees and photography, I wanted to give you guys some tips on how I make these photographs. And I think it's important to just mention that, you know, I work in communications as a conservationist for Wildlife Fund. I develop programs to help pollinators, but a lot of my work has been as a conservation photographer. And I was saying to Brooke before the webinar started that I don't have a degree in biology. My degree is more on the communication side of things, but I've always loved nature and insects since I was like in the first grade, or my earliest memories, like I've always loved insects. And for a long time, I felt embarrassed that I didn't have a degree in biology, until I realized that one of the advantages I have as being a non-scientist or non-PhD scientist, if you will, is that I can say things that scientists are sometimes uncomfortable saying. So I can get very excited about bees. I can maybe creep into the territory a little bit of anthropomorphism, which is a no-no for scientists in terms of helping people connect with insects. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, like I have a difficult time connecting with insects, and yet they're so important. And one of the main ways that I've been able to do that is through my photography. I've widely published and do a lot of work with a lot of different organizations around trying to raise the status of bees. And photography is so important, but you have to do photography in a way that helps your viewer connect with the subject. A lot of photographs that you see of insects are very scientific in nature. Things are changing. I mean, certainly as digital has come along and Instagram and things like that, like people are paying a lot more attention to insects, but there's still a lot of work to do. And photographing them, quite honestly, is challenging because they are small and they are fast and they are elusive. So I think one of the first questions I like to ask people when they're thinking about getting into photographing insects is like, what is your goal? Are you just wanting to make a documentation like, hey, I saw this thing in my garden. I think it's cool. I just want to take the picture so that I can show other people what I saw. Or are you like me and you're trying to communicate as an artist, or are you trying to communicate as a conservationist, like about the subject you're photographing? And it could be both. But depending on what side you fall on this divide, will help you determine the kind of equipment that you could get. So a lot of people ask me, like, should I get a DSLR or a mirrorless camera and invest in that, or can I just use my phone? And there are pluses and minuses to both, so I thought I would just start out by breaking that down. So with a phone, there are a few pros. Like you always have it with you. I take plenty of photos of bees and stuff with my phone. You can actually shoot high resolution files with your phone. In fact, I know that National Geographic and some major contests are now accepting photos shot on an iPhone if the files are large enough. New phones, especially iPhones and some of the, I think Samsung, I use iPhone, so I'm not 100% sure, have really good macro capabilities. So you can photograph very small subjects really well. The cons are, it's slow response time. You're trying to photograph something, clicking on your screen or whatever, it's challenging. You don't have true flash, which is really important, as I'll get into. There's poor native magnification. So basically what that means is you can do a pinch and zoom, like a digital zoom, but the photograph, the best photographs are made where the lens is giving you that true optical magnification and you're not pinching and zooming, because basically all you're doing in that case is just cropping in on the image that the photograph is made. It's not actually zooming in more. And so with a high quality macro lens or a good macro lens, you can get quite close, but still keep that sharpness in that detail. And again, the other difference is it's a phone, right? So it has this really great camera on it that's great for photographing your family and yourself. But when you're getting into specialized work like macro, it gets more challenging. However, there are some really great lenses for your phone. And there are a bunch of different brands. I would just recommend that you look online for like best of macro clip-on lenses. Sandmark, Sandmarc, is one of the best brands you can get, and you can get ones that will go up to 10 times life size. So you can get a pretty good resolution. This is a photograph that a friend of mine made. He's a botanist, but he loves bees, and so he's often going out. So you can see that there's not the sharpness there that you would get with a DSLR, but it still makes a pretty cool picture. And so again, it just really gets into what your goals are. But people take it too far too, I think. Like this is like a zoom lens that you can get for your phone. If like at some point, maybe it's better just to invest in a camera. And ultimately, if you get serious about this work, that's where you're going to end up anyway. So it's kind of like where, just figure out where you want to go and go from there. Um, the pros of buying an actual camera is it's made for the job. There are lots of different options for macro lenses you can get. You can have fast shutter speeds and use high-speed flash. You have really large files, which is advantageous because you can crop in and still still have a really large file to print. Cons is expensive. There's more gear to carry in the field, and there's a learning curve. But honestly, don't be afraid of the learning curve because if you work with it, if I can learn how to do photography, I promise you can do the same. So here's a few just tips that I think are quite helpful. One is changing your perspective. Such a simple tip, but you would be surprised how many people don't do this. So as I mentioned earlier, we're all giants, right? And so when we approach very small subjects, oftentimes you'll see people photographing insects on the ground, like, Night of the Living Dead or The Mummy. You're walking around with your hands out with your iPad or your iPhone, and meanwhile, the poor insect on the ground is terrified. I mean, imagine yourself from the perspective of an insect looking up. Actually, I'm just going to advance this slide. I can't really even stand to look at it, but you can understand why they fly away. So if we get on the level of our subjects, we start making that eye contact, A, our photographs are going to be more interesting, and B, you're going to be able to see the reactions of that insect in a way that you can't if you're towering over them, because these insects and these small animals do see us, they do notice us, they see our shadows, they see our movement, and so it really just helps you honestly connect better with the subject, which will lead to a better photograph. And along those lines, when we think about eyes, it's really important to get the eyes in focus of your subject. When we photograph people, if we photograph monkeys or any kind of mammal, we're always making sure, generally speaking, that we're getting those eyes sharp, because that is, as a very visual creature with binocular vision, we're looking for similar things in the subjects that we're looking at. So it helps a photograph seem sharp. You can see on this photograph of the monkeys, they are not, the background is quite soft, which is great, but their faces are in focus, and that's really, I guarantee you, in most cases, all you're looking at are those eyes. So with insects, it's the same thing. Even if the rest of the insect is out of focus, if you have those eyes in focus, then the viewer is going to be able to connect with your subject. Same goes with reptiles. It doesn't really matter what the subject is. Really trying to get those eyes in focus is generally a good rule of thumb. But of course, there are exceptions, and you might be trying to photograph a different part or an abstract, but still try to get those eyes in focus. The other thing that I really advise, and something I've been doing for my entire career, is playing biologist. So it's really important to understand the behavior of your subjects, because when you get into the field, there is a good chance you only have one shot to photograph something, or so you have to know how it's going to behave, or it helps you to predict where you can photograph certain scenes. So, for example, these carpenter ants that I photographed in southern Appalachians, they tend to or herd these beach blight aphids. Ants of many species have these relationships with aphids where they treat them like cattle, essentially protecting them in exchange for honeydew, which is a sugary liquid that these aphids expel. And I knew that every fall, because I had studied the biology, that I could find this situation, which is just underneath a very small beech leaf, by the way. I could find these ants doing this in the landscape. So it's understanding that biology that helps. And also it helps us to pick up on clues in the environment. So if you ever see leaves with cuts like this in it, it means that there's probably a leafcutter bee nest nearby. And I knew, because I'd read up on these bees quite a lot, that within 25 feet, generally speaking, of where you see these pieces of leaf cut out of leaves being cut out like this, you're going to be able to find the nest of a leafcutter bee. So I just basically started doing concentric circles around where these plants were, and sure enough, I was able to find the mother leafcutter bee going back to her nest with a bit of the leaf. So biology and reading up really does help. Now, I thought what I would do is kind of explain to you the different terminology of macro and close up, because it gets very confusing when you get into trying to find the right lenses, or even to even know what kind of photography you're doing. And because I'm old, and when I started shooting, in the 90s, we were still using slide film. It was before digital, and so basically, if you were to hold up a piece of slide film next to this, actually, this is a tiger beetle. If you held it up next to the tiger beetle in real life would be twice as big as the insect on the slide. So that's half life size, or 1 to 2, or 5x, 0.5x. So this is in the realm of close-up photography. If you hold up that insect next to the slide and they're the same size, then that's getting into the realm of true macro. So it's written as 1 to 1 or 1x. And that's how you know, okay, this lens is a true macro lens, because it can be 1x or greater. There are also ultra macro lenses that allow you to get even closer in. So 4 to 6x gets into the territory of ultra macro. And so that's kind of really helpful to set the scene. Now there's some few tips that I'd recommend if you want to really make the most of your macro attempts. One is something called paralleling the subject, where you're keeping the back of your camera parallel to your subject. So if you've got your camera held up to the subject, you want to try to keep it as parallel as possible to the subject because depth of field or the areas that are in focus in an image are very shallow with macro because of the way that the optics work, the size of your subject. You don't have a lot of room to move back and forth. So by keeping it parallel, you're going to increase your chances of having the subject more in focus. I also typically use manual focus for macro. So that means I set my magnification where I want to be, and then I move my body in until, and I'm looking through the viewfinder, I move my body in until I see it sharp in the viewfinder, and then I hit the shutter button. If you're trying to use autofocus in the grass and things like that where insects are moving around, chances are it's going to focus in on a piece of grass and the insect's going to move. So manual is really helpful. Other things you can do, I don't use a tripod very often unless it's a situation like, say, a spider in a web or a insect butterfly coming out of a chrysalis, because insects move a lot. But using a bean bag can be really helpful on the ground level to give you something to steady your camera on as you're photographing a subject. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, paying attention to your subject's behavior really helps. So there's a couple of different ways to go with lenses. You can get what's called a prime lens, which is a fixed magnification, so like a 1 or 2 times life size, or you can get a zoom lens, which will allow you to photograph everything from landscapes down to macro. Both have their advantages. If you get serious about macro, I would really recommend going the prime route because there are fewer elements of glass within that lens, which means that there's less diffraction and there's more, you're going to get more sharpness. And I would say the other thing that's really important to point out is that, most cameras that you can find today are quite good. I mean, compared to what I was shooting on 20 years ago or what, I don't know, Ansel Adam was shooting on, like cameras are way, way advanced from that, right? But what really does make a difference is the quality of the glass in your lens. So if you get serious about photography of any kind, get a good body, a camera body, but invest in really good glass because that's where the differences come in. Lens speed is another thing to consider. Not as big of an issue with macro because macro lenses, you're typically going to be around f11 or f16 on your f-stops to try to get that maximum depth of field. But lens speed is basically how wide of an aperture you can open your lens up on to photograph the subject. Because if you're able to open it wider, that means more light comes in. It's really a bit more applicable to bird photography, but just bring that up. The other thing that's really important with macro is working distance. So that's the distance from the front of your lens to the subject, which is really important. And I like to be as close as possible to the subject because it means that I can light it better and those kinds of things. Now, in the time that's left, I want to give you just a few examples of some of the lenses that you can use. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but this will be recorded so you can go back and look through it. I'm not going to belabor the point because I want to talk about flash very quickly right at the end. So for half-life size, I love this lens. I took Kino 100. None of these lenses are super expensive. Um, I'm a budget buy used gear kind of guy when I can, so I'm not trying to sell you guys the most expensive lenses, but this is a really sharp lens that gets you to half-life size, and it can do something like this. So very good lens. Similar to this as well. These are all examples with that kind of half-life size magnification. For true macro, the lens that I really love is this Venus Optics Laowa 100 millimeter 2X. They also have a 65 millimeter version, sharp as a tack, built like a tank, around $400. So that's not too bad for a really high quality lens. And you can photograph stuff like this. You could also get really close and do those full frame, life-size true macro images with this as well. So great lenses for this kind of work. For ultra macro, their Laowa also has a really great ultra macro lens, same price point, around $450. It allows you to go from 2.5 times life size to 5 times life size. So great little lens, very small lens, not heavy, built really well, great glass. A little bit tough to use, but I'd start with the 1X if you're new to macro or the 2X, but I wouldn't go here to begin with unless you're very diligent with your practice. But you can photograph really small bees in really dramatic ways. And even things like tiny springtails. These are in an egg cup in my kitchen. So these are really tiny organisms. Some of them were almost too small to see with the naked eye, but it gives you a sense of what you can do. Now, one of my favorite techniques that I enjoy using is something called close wide or wide angle macro. I have used for many years this lens from Sigma, 15 millimeter diagonal fisheye, which is like a corrected fisheye that allows you to get around an inch and a half from your subject. And you can make these beautiful portraits that place your subject in the context of their habitat, which is really important for conservation work because I want to show the subject in beautiful detail, but I also want people to understand that this species needs habitat to survive. And it just works great for making these dramatic portraits. And here, just to give you an example of the difference, I was on a tour in Little St. Simon's Island in Georgia, sort of the Altamaha River between Georgia and Florida. Our group came across this large 6 foot plus yellow rat snake. And I was like showing them like, okay, you can photograph it like this. It's a pretty pedestrian photograph, or we can get down on the level of the subject, move carefully over, make a beautiful wide angle portrait. And people started photographing and filming me thinking I was going to get bitten in the face by the subject, by the snake, but turned out great for everybody and was able to make this much different portrait with this technique. You can see the people photographing me, and as a bonus, everyone was color coordinated with the snake. So it's a great technique that I use a lot to do things like this. And just to give you a sense of how small this bee is and how small these dwarf rhododendrons are in the tundra, here is the situation. Here is me actually photographing this picture up on a mountain, very small flowers, handheld flash. It works really well. And it's great for conservation stories too. This is a Lamosa harlequin toad, and when I photographed this, this was the last known breeding pool for this toad. So I wanted to be able to show its habitat in the species to help raise support for its protection. A few tips that I'm going to go through super quickly. Looking at the sky is really important. This technique works great on blue sky days. Testing your exposure on, maybe before you start tasting the bee, look at some flowers in the same field, test your exposure, and then search for the bees because you're not going to have to change your exposure very much once you set that. Using flash is really important. Following the direction of the sunlight is really helpful. So basically, casting your shadow on your subject and then using flash to fill in that shadow allows you to balance the foreground and the background. And it helps to be able to see in the distance for it to work. Um, I'm pre-focusing, so I'm basically oftentimes shooting blind. I'm pre-focusing the distance and then moving my camera in without actually looking through the viewfinder. A lot of times to shoot this, I tend to shoot it around f/16, and avoiding strong vertical lines like pine trees in the background will help the image look, you'll have that scale and scope off into the distance. And then the final lens I wanted to share with you is a Sigma 180 macro, but I don't think this lens is made anymore, but you can also find it used, and there are other long macros. These are great because they really do an awesome job of making a beautiful, soft bokeh background, as it's called, really making blurry, messy details very soft and fuzzy. This is a rough green snake climbing through some trees. Very tons of highlights on these oak leaves, but with this lens, everything just compresses together and looks like a watercolor, which I love. And then the very last thing I wanted to talk about is flash. I could do a whole class on this, and I have many times, but I just wanted to say that flash is really important for macro for a number of reasons. In part because you're often shooting subjects down in the grass where they're very small and they're moving quickly. Flash allows us to fill in those shadows. And the subjects move, so it helps to freeze that motion. But when I first started out, I was not using very much flash. I was shooting natural light, which is beautiful, but it really does have its limitations because if you're photographing something like a dragonfly emerging at sunrise, as soon as the sun starts moving, the vegetation, when the sun comes up and the wind starts blowing, the vegetation starts moving, the subject's going to be blurry. And you're going to have to force yourself to open up to a really wide aperture, getting back to that fast lens idea, to allow enough light to come in to give you a fast enough shutter speed. So by using flash instead, you can make it look very natural, but you don't have this blurry motion that you get when you're not using flash. And the other thing that flash is really helpful for, which might seem counterintuitive, is filling in harsh light. So you can dial down your exposure and use softly diffused flash to create a better picture. And so a lot of times what I'm using is simply fill flash, which was designed to fill in shadows in bright situations. So this is a backlit bee. I'm using fill flash to just fill in the shadows in the foreground. Super, super helpful. Short bursts of this flash help to freeze motion. And I love to shoot insects that are backlit, flying towards the sun. Backlighting really gives you that beautiful rim light, and there's just a little pop of fill flash in the foreground. You can create really dramatic pictures any time of day. I'm just going to say very quickly that thinking of flash can be very intimidating to people, but just think of it like a recipe. You start with your available light, which is like if you're making a soup, that's your broth, and then you're adding in one ingredient at a time. So get your exposure set the way you want it to be, and then you add in flash. If you're using multiple flashes, just one at a time, and you'll get there. Don't try to turn everything on at once and do everything at once, otherwise it will freak you out and you'll stop doing it. So we're getting close to the end here, but I just want to give you one example of how flash will help in a natural setting. This is a leaf mimic katydid that I photographed down in Panama. And so what I've done is I've started out with that ambient light, that natural light. That's the broth of my soup. So I've set my exposure to do that. But you can see this is a kind of a dark, not exciting, muddy looking picture. So now I'm holding a flash and it looks pretty good. It looks much better, but the flash to me is still too harsh. It doesn't look natural. So one of the easiest things you can do, particularly if you're hand holding your flash, if you have your flash off camera, is just move it further away from your subject and it gives you this more diffuse light. So it just goes to show that like flash can create very natural looking pictures. I use flash almost all the time, but it just helps you be more productive as a photographer and get those images that you want. This is an example of how I shot that Katie did on the image before, just hand holding that flash. And if you're not comfortable hand holding it, you can get brackets to hold your flash off camera. But please be sure to diffuse. This is my final tip that's so important is that flash needs to be diffused. So there's lots of different kinds of diffusers you can get. It really just spreads out the light, helps it to be really soft. This is the kind of diffusion system that I generally use now. Just look up macro diffuser online and you can find them that will fit your particular setup. There are expensive versions and then there are knockoff versions like this that you can buy on eBay for like not very much, but they're usually coming from like China, so it does take a while to arrive. But and you can find templates online too if you're crafty. But then you have these beautiful, softly lit portraits that make a difference, and you can use soft boxes for the same an idea, or people get really creative in using chip canisters. But taking it off camera, and then the last thing I'll mention, which go back and check this out later, is set your flash to what's called rear curtain sync and set it to high speed sync on your camera. Sometimes that's called different things. So you might have to do some Googling. You may not find it in your instruction manual, but the combination of those two things will make a huge difference because it helps to regulate when the flash fires in your exposure. So it's firing with rear curtain at the end of the exposure versus the beginning, which means if a subject's moving, the very last thing that happens is the flash fires, makes a sharp impression, shutter closes. And then with high speed sync, it means that you can go beyond 1/25th of a second or 2/50th of a second and really freeze motion. You can shoot at 4,000th of a second shutter speed with a very quick burst of flash. And that combination makes photographing insects in flight so much easier. And so even if it's blurry, you still have these sharp impressions over the top. Finally, I would invite you to visit World Wildlife Fund's page, our webpage for our initiative at worldwildlife.org/pollinators to learn what WWF is doing and my role to help protect pollinators, primarily by reducing pesticides. And now I just want to stop. We have a couple minutes, went a little bit long, but I appreciate your patience and would love to hear any questions that you might have.
Clay, that was amazing. Oh my gosh. I was so drawn into all of that, both learning about the bees and also learning how to photograph them. I wish I had my camera in hand with me right now and I was in the field and you were like showing me what to do. I've never done any macro, but now I want to. You got me super inspired. Oh, are you still there, Clay? I think we lost you. Oh, I think Clay left. Oh no. We'll give him a second to see if he pops back in, everyone. But I think he might have accidentally hit the wrong button. Oh, okay. We'll just give him a second. Oh, there he is. I think he's popping back in.
I'm here. I'm so sorry.
Oh no, it's okay, Clay. We lost you. It's okay. Welcome back.
That was a
Um,
mic drop.
yes, you're like, oh, I did my presentation. I'm out. No,
I'm
that
out.
was
Peace.
Well, thanks, Clay, for that. Yes, so we do have a couple questions that have come in, and anybody, we have a few more minutes, so go ahead and pop them on in there. Lots of excellent presentations coming in, Clay. People enjoyed it just as much as me. Um, I do like this question. If you could go back to the basics a little bit, what exactly is nectar? What are the bees going for when they are at flowers? What is that substance?
That's a really great question. So basically, you can think about that bees are after two general kinds of food sources. So pollen is their protein. So they will, active bees in the landscape are going to be feeding on protein in the form of pollen, but also nectar is like their flight fuel. It's sugar. So they're using that. That's how they can move around really quickly. They have a very high metabolism. So they're using that nectar to really fuel their flights and keep them active.
Perfect. There you go. That makes sense. It's like our carbs and our protein, you know.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, that's awesome. Great. Okay. So we do have a lot of questions asking about mirrorless cameras and how maybe some your presentation translated to that. Are there any particular lenses or what people should look for if they have, a new R5 or some of the Sony or Nikon versions? Yeah, what should people look for?
So mirrorless, it works very similarly to DSLRs, and I'm on my last DSLR that I'll ever own, I imagine, because mirrorless have such quick shutters that there's a lot of advantages to using mirrorless, and the cameras are actually smaller, which is also advantageous for macro. Um, but in general, everything else works pretty much the same. So the same tips that I've given you here will work just the same for mirrorless, except that I think mirrorless has a leg up on DSLRs in terms of the speed of the shutter and the quality of tracking as well. I do know that, or I have heard that certain Sony cameras, for example, have some tracking features that allow you to track insects, maybe like butterflies, large bees. So, I'm hoping for more of that sort of stuff because photographing a bee in flight is challenging, but if I could have an autofocus capability that would allow me to track them, particularly if they're kind of in the same area, that'd be a game changer. So yeah, I'm all for mirrorless. I think just kind of follow the same rules. And a lot of these lenses that I mentioned, particularly like the Laowa 1X, 2X, they will have versions for mirrorless, I assume, and I believe they have versions for mirrorless cameras that work quite well as well.
Great. Yeah, that makes total sense. I know that my Canon mirrorless has really good bird tracking and stuff like that, animals
Mhm.
in flight. But I will say I've never tried macro, so I can't say it's bee tracking abilities. So maybe somebody in the comments could tell us if they've tried this macro with their Canon mirrorless. So the last question here, and I would also like to hear a little bit too. What is the difference between a bumblebee and a carpenter bee?
Okay, that's a great question. They look very similar. Their bodies are pretty much the same size. There are quite a lot of differences. One is if you just look at a carpenter bee versus a bumblebee in the field, like they're on a flower, the abdomen, the biggest part of the body on the carpenter bee is going to be shiny. In most cases, it's going to be quite shiny, whereas a bumblebee is covered in hairs. So you can see that visual difference. They also carry pollen in different ways. So pollen baskets are going to be present on bumblebees, whereas with a carpenter bee, pollen is just going to be kind of all over the back legs, maybe other parts of the body. So those are just sort of superficial differences. But getting to the biology, so carpenter bees are really interesting in that they are solitary, like most bees. They, don't have this big colony that they are defending in the same way that like a bumblebee would, where you have a queen and you have all these workers. But what's really interesting about the biology of carpenter bees, at least in the genus Xylocopa, which are the large ones that you'll see flying around structures, is that they have a system where the daughters from the current generation, like if a female is laying eggs, she's not a queen, but her daughters will sometimes stay in the nest, a few daughters, like maybe four or five, to help her rear the young. And then when she dies, they'll take over that nest because these nest cavities are hard to find. So they have a very primitive social style, but in general, they are solitary bees. And the other thing I would just mention is that if you see like a carpenter bee flying around, particularly if they have a yellow patch on their face, those are the males. So they can't sting, And what they're doing is they're not trying to sting you or attack you. They are there to defend a patch of flowers or a nest site from competing males. That's their whole job. They want to have as many females feeding on those flowers as possible so that they can mate with them. So you don't see that hovering um, ability with bumblebees. Bumblebees will fly around you sometimes when you approach in a flower. And what they're doing in that case is not trying to defend themselves. They're memorizing you as part of the landscape. So you're like a mountain that they're memorizing. So when they come back to those flowers, so a lot of times people will freak out. But even if it's fun to kind of play around with carpenter bees, especially the males. If you see them hovering under a flower, you can throw a little pebble and they'll chase after it, thinking it's another insect flying into their flight space. But so they have those different kinds of ways of living.
Oh, how fascinating. Yeah, I'm actually, just as a quick side note, my very first research project when I was an undergrad was actually with a bee pollinator specialist at OSU. And so that was my very first project. If only I would
Oh,
have known
cool.
you then and had a real camera when I was like 19 years old, I could have taken some really cool bee photos for you. But
Oh well,
oh,
next time,
good memories.
next
Yes,
life.
good memories. Well, Clay, this has been incredible. I have so many thank yous in the comments here, and I want to thank you as well. So I would love to turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Yeah, sure. I just want to thank everybody for attending. And one of the things that I love most about bees is that, there are some big problems facing bees, like, pesticides, that it's more challenging for us to help that. Certainly we can speak up around policies to help bees. But what I love about bees and talking to people about bees is if you provide plants in your yard, ideally native wildflowers that are blooming from spring all the way to fall. If you reduce or eliminate pesticides in your yard and you give bees a place to nest, they will show up and they will continue to show up in diversity and in beauty. It is a true build it and they will come kind of scenario. And I always like to encourage people to imagine what if your yard was a pollinator habitat? You influenced your neighbor, and before you know it, you have these pollinator corridors through cities. There's so much property that could be great bee habitat without a bit of legislation, with very little money, and you can make a real difference for species. And I think that is the thing that I love. And they're so fascinating. And even in your backyard, and whether you're in Ohio or Australia or anywhere you're at, I guarantee you, you can see something that someone's never seen before. Like there's just so much to learn. So I like that kind of factor.
Yeah, no, that was so good. And I could not agree more. Well, thank you so much, Clay. I've been highly entertained today, and I feel like I learned so much, and I'm sure that everybody listening did as well. So thank you again for coming on today. And I would like to thank everybody who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.